Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How's it going, Dave?
It's going well, Matt. We went to Mexico for the kids' fall break on cheap Frontier tickets, which is always kind of fun. Flying on Frontier. It's a little bit of a nightmare, but got there on the cheap and used points, and we were in Cancun, and we only got scammed for about 700 total pesos when everything was said and done. Do not try to take an Uber or Lyft ride if you ever fly into Mexican airport. They're owned by the Mexican state mafia.
Oh,
and
wow.
they don't allow Ubers to go in there. So we ended up calling one, and he pretended like he was coming and never came. So that and a lot of beautiful weather and a couple hundred pesos stolen from the hotel room. But at the end of the day, I think we're down less in Mexico than in Saratoga, but good time. I think it's always good to, if you can do it. Montreal's probably the best example of this, but to take your younger children, they're not that young, they're now 11 and 13, to an international environment. I think it helps them grow and see the difference between their way of life and the way of life of others, which is a theme of this podcast as well as episode anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thinking about different options and kind of expanding the imagination there. Yeah, Rachel and I honeymooned in Montreal. We've not been back since, but that would be a fun place to return with the kids. I don't know. I'm not taking this as a ringing endorsement of a Mexican trip for us, but flying with 6 of us is sometimes a challenge as well. So we're more likely to go at the driving range, which would probably be Montreal or other parts north. But it all sounds pretty attractive at the moment. It's pouring rain outside today, and it's one of those like fall days where you just think, yep, okay, settle in, because you got 4 or 5 months of this and worse coming up. So welcome to northern New Jersey.
It was definitely a weather shock when we left real feel 100 degrees and got back to Colorado, and it was about 30. But there's the winter and snow to look forward to, and it should snow here pretty soon. We haven't had our first snow yet, but I imagine any day now maybe we're taping a show, I'll show you the snow outside. But
Well, you have the mountains and you'll have the skiing and all that. So we'll just have the slop for the most part. We've got a few hills around here. There are actually a few snow places where they're skiing, but it's kind of embarrassing, honestly, having skied out west, mostly in Washington State, I guess. Some in California, actually, when I was very young. And then a little bit in Vermont. You come around here and elevation, I mean, we're actually at 1,000 feet ourselves, just at our house. And maybe you go up a few more 100 feet, and that's about it. So they're all pretty much bunny hills, whatever symbol they give them. So it's not quite the same thing as out where you are.
it's coming. Yeah. Looking forward to that.
Good. Well, last time we looked at chapter 2 in the book Fighting Enemies, Foreign and Domestic: The Legacy of Angelo M. Codevilla. And that chapter was by Robert Riley, entitled Angelo Codevilla, the Anti-Millenarian. And we're going to do a quick recap and then move forward. And a special episode today because we're doing Dave's chapter. So we'll let him introduce that in just a minute. But if you recall, last episode, we were talking about what an anti-millenarian is. And of course, first thing you have to know is what's a millenarian. And so we've traced a really long strand of Western thinking around the idea of ushering in the millennium, bringing in some kind of ultimate victory over the problems that have troubled life since the fall. And we think about poverty, we think about crime, we think about war. And really in the Middle Ages, but then more increasingly in the modern era, there's been a whole series of movements that have really aimed to identify that problem, which is the source of all our troubles, and to solve that problem. And while many of these have led to, you might say, misplaced policy, there's been worse consequences as well, because when you think that you're actually going to bring in the millennium, when you think we are this close to the final victory over poverty or war, then there's really very little that you would allow to stand in your way. And people that are so foolish as to doubt your project, or worse, to oppose your project, have to be done away with. And, we use that language. It's strong language, but that's actually the language that we see repeatedly in these movements. You think about the way that the Soviet Union justified, tens of millions of murders of their own people and the people of Eastern Europe, those that were not willing to move with history toward the realization of the Marxist utopia. And of course, we see this to lesser degrees, but still significant body counts in many other movements like National Socialism and the Nazi movement and others. And so, as we talk about Dr. Codevilla's legacy as an anti-millenarian, we see him as one who was always wanting to take us back to the limits that are put in place by nature. Again, after the fall, the challenges that human beings face that can't be done away with. They can be mitigated to certain degrees. There's better and worse ways of dealing with the troubles that press us, and the American founders were very much attuned to that. But nevertheless, modern progressivism, at least in its more radical variants, has tried to push in this direction to such a degree that we suffer many costs of that effort. And Dr. Codevilla wanting to bring a realism back to American politics through his efforts and those of like-minded folks was really key to recovering something like the founders' sensibilities and the founders' appreciation for what can and can't be done by political means.
Yeah, I think the pairing of words in describing Codevilla, he was a moral realist. And oftentimes today, when we take a look at the word moral, we think imagined, or we think an idealist. Or when we take a look at the word realist, we think amoral. Is it possible to have a hybrid accounting, a hybrid paradigm of the world where you want to understand what is real, but you don't exclude from reality the moral reality within reality? And I think that the proper understanding, one that Codevilla had, is one in which you kind of recognize the universe to the degree we can in its full. So there is such a thing as the God who created the world, created nature within it, and created human beings in his image. And we do have the ability to create things ourselves. So you've got God, nature, and human artifice. And as you were just mentioning, Matt, the danger, the temptation to believe that you can use human artifice to remake the world and make it perfect is a temptation that has been around for a couple hundred years and has led to great crimes against humanity. It's actually, this is the words of C.S. Lewis, it's made us kind of move beyond humanity to the abolition of the humane and humanity. So how do you fight against that? You've got to fight against that temptation within yourself to believe that you can perfect all things. And you've got to focus on what is real, which I think Angelo Codevilla did a great job in all of his writings and all of his intellectual work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's now turn our attention to the third chapter, which is Angelo Codevilla's America, a possession for all time. And again, Dave, as the author of the chapter, there's nobody better to give us an overview of the argument.
Yeah, well, one thing, Matt, when you're writing any type of festschrift or essay in honor of your mentor, there's a lot of pressure because you want to get it right. You want to represent that individual. So, in the genesis of writing this chapter, I was thinking, okay, well, how would Codevilla write a chapter about Codevilla, and who would be the individuals who he would want to be parallel with him? And the one that comes to mind is, and I begin the chapter with this individual, is the Greek historian, the Athenian historian, Thucydides. I wrote my dissertation on the rise and decline of Athens based upon what happens when a democracy becomes imperial. But at the core of the dissertation, and Codevilla thought this was a right interpretation of Thucydides, what I argued was that while Athens falls, and Athens has its day, its golden age, Thucydides, as an Athenian who identifies himself as an Athenian at the beginning of the history, is able to carry on a sense of what made Athens great by writing his history in a very Athenian way. So his history possesses a far-sightedness that were the Athenians at their best, a prudence and discernment that were the Athenians at their best, a liberality in the best sense of the word, a fairness, a transparency. All these things that made Athens great at its beginning are within Thucydides, the author. And I start there because I actually believe that if you were to try to pin down who Codevilla was, I think Codevilla in his writings was trying to be an American at his best, and to take all of those things that we've talked about over the last couple of months, all those principles, equality, responsibility, honor, prudence, lawfulness, and justice, and to represent them to the best of your ability as an individual in your writing and in a public representation of what it means to be an American. We often tell ourselves, right, that what's a good citizen? A good citizen is someone who loves their country, and that's great. And if you have the capacity to love your country, amazing, you should. But what if you could embody what that country is at its best? And I think America at its best is an experiment in self-government. And I think we see that it truly is an experiment. It has failures. Things that go wrong, and you have to identify those things that go wrong in order to move in a better direction. But to do so, you have to understand how regimes work. And I think that's kind of where I set off the chapter. Codevilla, in trying to be the best American he could be, had to bring back within the public discourse this language of what a regime is, how regimes operate, and why they're so essential in understanding the evolution of any people, of any nation. So how do you think Codevilla approaches this subject of regime, Matt? What would you say? Who is he following the footsteps on and bringing back this language of the regime back into the fold?
Yeah, well, certainly calling back to Aristotle, the real master of the ancient political frameworks of the language of regimes and his politics, which we've gone through at length on a series of podcasts. So go back and listen to those if you want more. But I was thinking about at a practical level, one of the things that you mentioned in a previous podcast was that Dr. Codevilla came to the United States as a young boy. And so he was not born here. Neither you nor I actually were born in the United States either, but we were Americans in a sense from our birth, despite that. But he wasn't. And so one of the things that brings regime sensibility to one's mind, as you were just talking about a moment ago with visiting Mexico or visiting Quebec, is the notice of difference, a recognition that the life that I live isn't universal. And, we can have those moments, I guess, experiences within the United States. You can go, to the inner city, or if you're somebody who lives in the country or vice versa, and you can have those kind of eye-opening moments and think, oh, wow, even in America, people live different lives than the one I live. Or, maybe you grow up in a Christian context and you visit a, secular university and you see a different life. But to a greater degree, to come from Italy, post-World War II Italy, and come to the United States, was something where he was going to be consciously aware of what was happening, what was different about the United States, what were those decisions and principles that were being embodied in the things that he observed. And so, sort of self-consciously taking on the identity of an American. And I think, he did that in a way that many of us who have been Americans our whole lives never really quite do, right? Maybe you study, and maybe we've done some of that in our own work, in our academic careers. But for the typical American, there's no need to appropriate Americanness. You're already surrounded by it. But for him, that was something that he could self-consciously reflect upon, and even as a boy, notice the differences between where he was and where he had come to be, and the different ways of life and the ways of thinking about things that were more evident to him than perhaps would have otherwise been the case. And so I think that naturally took him back to the study of regimes and to Aristotle, and of course the modern best articulator of regime difference, I think, is de Tocqueville, who obviously is the namesake for our podcast, and we've also gone through that work. But But you think about those two works, Aristotle's Politics and Democracy in America is really the ancient and modern par excellence, discussion of the nature of regimes, the differences between one way of life under a certain political orientation and organization, and another way of life under a different political organization and orientation.
Yeah, and the imprint that those differences leave upon you, it's definitely an intellectual imprint in the case of Codevilla, but it's not simply an intellectual imprint. It is an imprint upon the heart. One of the most touching references within the book about Codevilla is when he and his mother, his father had died while he was in the womb, they approach the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island along with other Italian immigrants, and he said, "We wept." The difference between where we were coming from and the hope and opportunity of where we were going to was that immense that we wept. And certainly you can have an intellectual commitment to the rightness of your regime, but do you have a love of your regime as well? And that comes through, I think, in Codevilla's person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other thing I would mention there is that we talked about the millenarian temptation in our last episode, where a lot of these millennialists believe that all human beings can be reduced down to kind of a simple thing, like all human beings are X. So for Marx, for example, all human beings are either bourgeois or proletariat. They're either haves or have-nots. And this approach of regimes, recognizes the great variety of human experience and suggests within it that you can't simply reduce human beings to just one universal type. And by the way, this was something that was going on very much at the time where he was trying to reintroduce the concept of regime to Americans. Here we are in the mid to late 1990s. The Cold War has ended. And a famous essay that became a book came out by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History, in which there's a suggestion there that everything is going to be subsumed within this kind of universalization of liberal democracy. Everyone's going to be liberal Democrats, and we'll be able finally to overcome any type of clash between different types of people because we'll all become the same type of person. And that was a very powerful thesis at the time, and people believed that we were truly going to enter into an age of the end of history where, what do we have to do at this point? Well, we just have to simply make the global economic pie as big as possible and have everyone practice, right, capitalism as its best, and we get the goods that allow us to be sustained. And then with regard to kind of any type of philosophic difference or moral difference, let's not go there, right? Let's just believe that we can't even answer any of those questions. We're just going to focus right on our material well-being. So that's a millennial temptation as well. So Codeville is fighting against that in bringing back this concept of regime, and by the way, bringing it back not in kind of a modern sense where you're like one regime is the same as another, right? And it's, well, this regime doesn't believe that stealing is a good thing. This regime believes it does. Well, that's just their way of doing things. Who are we to judge? Right?
Multiculturalism.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think that, no, let's take a look at what regimes are and let's judge those regimes as better or worse, as regimes that tend toward a common good or tend toward the individual advantage of a certain group. Being in Mexico last week and talking to an Uber driver, we were finally able to get one. And he talked about the disadvantage that he's at within that regime because he's not part of that state mafia that allows him to make a living. So he's got to make a living a different way.
Yeah.
You wouldn't realize that unless you were in that person's shoes. So having your antennae out and being able to make judgments thereafter. And I think that there's a reason why he wants to introduce the concept regime back to Americans, because I think if we move beyond a world where we believe that regimes matter, then it's going to lead us to be complacent. And I think the line in the chapter that I'll reference here, according to Codevilla, a nexus threatens to connect and corrupt men living under modern regimes, from dogmatic modern tyrants and would-be scientific philosopher kings to the pleasure-seeking vitiated multitude operating under their guidance. It promises order and comfort. It asks of men their obeisance. To the degree that the spectatorial mode of life draws men away from acting like citizens, it risks undermining the commitment to equality and liberty that had enabled the establishment of democratic rule in the first place. So there's a definite tie between understanding that regimes are important and your own moral agency to choose one regime or another.
Yeah, and to see that your regime is changing. That was another critical point, I think, that, and we'll talk about that more as we move along and work our way through this chapter. But to be able to look clearly at where you are and where you have been, and to measure the difference, and to get to a point where you say, you know, at a certain point, this is no longer the same regime. And so we're comparing regimes historically, as well as you might say at the same time and place across nations, but also there's the America of de Tocqueville's day, there's the America of the present day, and those aren't the same thing. And so thinking about how we differentiate between them and at what point we say the regime has changed in fundamental ways that are going to require us to go back and reintroduce ourselves to earlier ideas that we think we've just absorbed. We think we're just in that same stream with the founders, and yet we find ourselves ending up very different places and removed very much from their ways of thinking and practice.
Yeah, the tangible example that Codevilla would always use is the New York City subway. Back in 1950, everyone's smoking a cigarette and everyone's kind of dressed from head to toe, and smoking was legal. The regime, thought this was fine, but there was a certain decorum to how you dressed. Now you could go on a New York City subway in the year 2025 and find people half naked or almost naked. But you try to light a cigarette on New York City subway, that'll get you arrested, right? And a similar thing happens in California, right? That, marijuana is legal everywhere. Smoking, not so much. Well, how did this change come about? Well, the regime changed. The regime's love changed. The regime's laws changed. Well, what pushed that change? And we've talked a lot about the progressive movement over the 20th century, and really the powerful effect it's had on the American way of life. So this change happens over time, but there's a connection between the decisions that are made during the time of the Civil War, those that were made at the end of the 19th century, after World War II, and where we are today. And our way of life 50 years from now, our regime will be based upon the degree to which we exercise our moral agency. And we, of course, advocate, right, that our regime ought to look more like the regime that the founders put in place at the end of the 18th century, that it ought to operate according to the principles that we think allowed America to become a flourishing nation in the first place. But those things can be lost, right? And the history of humankind shows regimes coming into being and going out of being, from Athens to inevitably the United States.
Yeah, and Aristotle does a great job of showing how that happens. It's often through the working out of some of the internal principles of the regime on the one hand, or on the other hand, by the forgetting of those principles. And so I think we probably have maybe elements of both those things happening on the American scene. But Dr. Codevilla was a very discerning observer of what was changing and what was not, and was able to bring that forward to his audience in a way that they may not have noticed, and to be able to point out the changes that were being perhaps unconsciously adopted by regular Americans who if you were to describe it, in plain terms, might say, oh, that's not what I want at all. And yet just naturally absorbing the culture that's around you, politically and otherwise, and adopting ways of thinking and practice that are very foreign to our history.
Yeah, and I think another point, and this is where I begin to pivot in the essay, is that regimes don't exist in a vacuum. Regimes exist kind of within a civilizational context. So when you're talking about the change of the American regime between the 18th and 21st century, you've got to talk about that change kind of within the overall changes within Western civilization that have taken place in the modern world. And we referenced, kind of modernity, postmodernity all the time. And hence, for Codevilla, what happened civilizationally from the ancients to the medieval time to the modern time and now the age we live in has a tremendous influence upon the American regime. And to put it simply, the American regime can go the way of the rest of Western civilization which seem to have gone off kilter, or it can be an exception or partial exception to that movement of Western civilization. And this is why, and he was writing The Character of Nations when we were both graduate students and working for him, but he was also finishing up a translation of Machiavelli's Prince, which I would argue is the most important book written in the last 500 years, because Machiavelli, according to Codevilla and many others, had a project, and he wanted to move Western civilization in a certain direction. And in order to move it in a certain direction, he realized that if he used words in a certain way, he could change the way that human beings think about the world. He could change the paradigm in which they understand the world. We talked at the beginning of this episode that if you look at the world and you account for it, and you account for the supernatural, God, the natural, our part in the natural, human nature, and then recognize, okay, we do have the ability to use artifice, to art, to change things. Well, Machiavelli, if Machiavelli can erase God or the supernatural from your paradigm, so don't think about those things that you've never seen. Don't think about those things that are just simply imagined. Don't think about the ought. Just focus on this world. If he can get you through his words to think about the world that way, then to you, your horizon has shrunk. No longer do you have a horizon that takes into account the transcendent. Your only horizon, right, is this terrestrial world that we live in. And you look around, and if you can kind of define the terrestrial world we live in as a kind of a constant battle and war, then what are you going to do as a human being? Think, okay, I'm in a constant battle where I've got to try to overcome my enemies through force or seduction or whatever it may be. So Codevilla, realized that Machiavelli was able to use words in such a way in which he wasn't trying to understand what the truth is and relate the truth to others, but reduce the truth simply to that which is.
Yeah, I mean, the consequences could not have been more profound. I mean, as this got deeply embedded in Western civilization, the whole challenge it raises to anything transcendent. I mean, this is the anti-Christ doctrine, right? I mean, this is there's nothing. If all we have in the world is what we see, then we might as well eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And if there's more to it than that, though, then we have an entirely different way of living. And so as Machiavelli distracts us and tries to draw us away from the contemplation of the eternal to the very, very temporal, and from that which is ultimately real to that which is passing and transient, then there's really a profound impact on the individual as well as the community. Because as you say, Dave, we look around and we have no sense of anything beyond the immediate. What we see conflict, we see trouble, we see a dog-eat-dog kind of world. And how do you make it in a world like that? Well, you got to fight harder. You got to push further. You got to be willing to do the thing the other guy's not willing to do. And why restrain yourself? If life is short and you've got to climb to the top of the heap as fast as possible so you can enjoy it for some fleeting moment, go for it. But if that's all misguided, if that's all based on a constricted and restricted view of reality, then you've missed everything. And so, I mean, he's playing for keeps, and the consequences in terms of the imbibing of this and the operationalizing of this over the last 5 centuries have led Western civilization to profound moral degradation and troubles that it's very difficult for us to dig our way out of.
Yeah, and interestingly, in terms of the history of ideas, he definitely has given a template over to other modern political philosophers who like Machiavelli, try to do the same thing, try to kind of change the way that human beings think about the world. So philosophy becomes a tool of propaganda rather than what is actually a love of wisdom and a desire to move closer and closer towards an approximation of the truth. Funny, I was picking up my son Jack from school yesterday, and in his history class, they were covering Hobbes and Locke, and I was happy they said, I like Locke better than Hobbes. I really think Locke's right, though, because our minds are just, this tablet that things are written on. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second here. Is that reality? I mean, that if you move forward with this simple idea that, we're blank tablets and experience is all that there is, then once again, you're reducing everything to material. I didn't go into it to too great a length with Jack. He's 11 years old. But however, there was something to be said there. It's interesting when Codevilla was writing this chapter that he's translating Machiavelli, of course, as well. He's native-born Italian, and he doesn't clean up Machiavelli. He said that Machiavelli wrote The Prince like, Casey Stengel or some old baseball manager talked, very much in the vernacular. And he wanted to use that kind of common language because that's the way to make your new paradigm accessible to others. Talk the way they talk and kind of, use slang and all the rest. And here Machiavelli, Codevilla noted, is very different than other Italian writers like Dante, through his language is trying to kind of give you an understanding. You think of the Divine Comedy of what an ordered nature looks like. Mm-hmm. Machiavelli has no interest in that whatsoever. So, we've kind of laid out, Machiavelli's project. Well, what was Codevilla going to do about it, right? Here he is, just a political scientist living at the end of the 20th century. Is there a way to learn from Machiavelli without being won over by Machiavelli? And I think that we see in Codevilla someone who could learn how the master played his game and then be able to rebut that master. So how would you say that happens in the work of Codevilla?
Well, one thing you just pointed out was that Machiavelli wrote in very plain language. Of course, there were deeper things going on that you had to uncover and read with care, comparing this passage to the other passage. And by the way, just as a little bit of a plug here, I mean, you really should get his copy of The Prince if you've not read The Prince. It's Yale University Press. It's got a great introductory essay, a lot of good footnotes, some essays at the end by other distinguished scholars. So it's really a fine work of scholarship, and it'll help guide you through the reading of a text that, again, has this very plain surface teaching, but also some deep complexity that's worth pondering and reflecting upon. But yeah, Dr. Codevilla wrote in very plain prose. We've talked about how we would carve up our own writings and push us in that direction to write more succinctly, more clearly. He wanted people to be able to understand things. And so he would use words that corresponded to reality. And he would describe reality sometimes in blunt language that was not as polite as people were used to, but sometimes necessary to kind of jar you into that state of reality that maybe you'd escaped from as you'd been caught up in some other imagined vision of things that was painted for you by others in our culture. So, he wanted to use that kind of clarity to kind of burst the Machiavellian bubble and to speak plain truths in response to Machiavelli's plain truths. But Machiavelli's were half truths, and Dr. Codevilla wanted to tell the whole truth.
Yeah, and simply put, reality is real. You can change the meaning of a word or use it in a seductive way, whereby someone thinks the word maybe means something different. So virtue, for example, Machiavelli kind of changes the meaning of the word, but there is still something that's virtuous. And so what do you have to turn to? What virtue is in reality, what goodness is in reality, what war and peace are in reality, what justice as opposed to injustice is in reality. So these words inherently have meaning. They correlate to reality. You just have to talk that way and in a clear way, direct people back toward the premise that reality is real.
Yeah, of course, that was very countercultural at the point when he's writing this. This is sort of the high moments of the postmodern movement as it's emerging in the academy and being propagated out to society. This is when Bill Clinton is saying it depends on what the meaning of the word is. And exactly. So, we're navigating all those murky waters. And he says, no, we know what the word is means. That's actually not that complex. And many other plain facts that we can describe with words that correspond to reality. But the stakes are extremely high in this. If we can't speak in ways that correspond to reality, we have no contact with God. I mean, Jesus is referred to as the Word in the opening passages of the book of John. And if Christ is the Word, then there must be a way in word to describe something of who he is. Not all the depth and complexity of the deity, of course, but yet there has to be something that we can connect from the words that are used to describe him in the Gospels and throughout the rest of the Scriptures to the underlying reality of who he is. Or we have no contact with the God who made us and the God who's sent his Son to save us. So that, I mean, this is really critical stuff. And for us to just sort of lightly accept some of the claims of the postmodern movement that, well, words can be whatever they are, and reality is whatever you think it is, and all these things that begin to break down this link between the thing and the word used to describe the thing. This is really serious intellectual and moral error that we've been confronted with and assaulted with, you might say, over the last generation or two.
Yeah, so Codevilla's response is to assault stupidity himself, which
Yeah.
You and I joke offline often that, okay, well, our mentor was Angelo Codevilla. Other people had mentors that, often kind of smoothed the way for their kind of entrance into their professional field because, this person's a gentleman or this, that, or the other. Codevilla made many enemies, by speaking the way that he did and kind of redirecting all back toward reality. I wrote in the chapter that Codevilla was willing to anger his audience if his confrontational use of language and blunt analysis drew the well-meaning to uncomfortable yet essential truths about the stakes of human stupidity. Lies, buffoonery, and deception are real, dangerous, and worthy of our reflection, engagement, and contempt. They must be admonished in straightforward terms to the broadest possible audience. And Codevilla did that over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. As we learned in keeping the CIA up at night, right, that's why he kept the CIA up at night, because he was going to tell them what they were doing, and he knew what they were doing. He'd done his homework. And there were many others like that as well. So he was the quintessential bull in a china shop, but it was a postmodern china shop.
Yeah, and really following a long tradition there. I mean, you think about the way that Socrates deals with some of his interlocutors, not afraid to embarrass them, and sometimes it's that sort of shock treatment that's necessary for somebody to return to reality. And the emperor has no clothes kind of moments were very much a part of his writing style and goal, to make people realize that the thing that they were so sure of wasn't actually so, and that there was some more common sense wisdom that their neighbor, who they didn't think much of intellectually, knew better than they, who had been well educated out of reality, didn't know.
Yeah, he would say over and over to me when I was involved in politics, Corbin, you always have to remember the following line: who the hell do they think they are? They don't have reality on their side. Who the hell do they think they are? Be confident about trying your best to understand the truth of an issue or the reality of an issue, et cetera. I think that the great lesson for us all, the listeners, is we can do this too. We have reality at our disposal, right? If we're able to distill difficult concepts and understand axioms about how the world works and apply them to circumstances in an intelligible way, we're going to be a force for reality, for truth in this world, which is good. So that we can make, all of us can make that our intellectual objective. But I will come back to something I said earlier, though. There's an intellectual commitment to the truth, but you'd never understand Codevilla fully if you just thought his commitments were intellectual. His greatest commitment was to God, right? He loved God. He with all his heart, and his love of his family, and his love of his students, and his love of his country. That's what defined him, and that's very, very different than Machiavelli, who at some point at the end of The Prince sounds like an Italian patriot, but really has no care for what happens within the greater Italian regime. But Codevilla cared about the American regime. He wanted this thing to work. He saw how it had worked in his own life, and he wanted it to continue to work for Americans in the ages to come.
Yeah, I really appreciate that at the end of your chapter, how you said, he took this profound study all the ancients and the whole history of political philosophy and literature, and so widely read and so profoundly reflected upon, and he put that as service for his own country. So I want this to then guide our country, which of course we think about it. This is the most important country of the last two centuries, but in the long run, this is just one little country among many, and yet he loved it, and so he wants to use all that learning and all that understanding to improve the lives of his countrymen. I mean, it's a great kind of patriotism to have that kind of love for your neighbor that desires that neighbor's good, and to use all that learning and the profit from that study for that purpose, and to see that making America better was a task worthy of the greatest efforts.
Well, unfortunately, 20 years after he writes The Character of Nations and does this translation of Machiavelli's Prince, and we're with him most of this time, it just seemed year after year, no one was heeding this call, and we have just kind of one mess after another mess. We continue down kind of a postmodern track with how we define the sexes, et cetera. I mean, you can name your thing that's happening.
Right.
Too big to fail, COVID, you name it. It seems over and over again, it seemed like we hadn't followed his advice. It seems now like there may be an opening for this kind of return to reality and return to moral realism. But the truth of the matter is, in the year 2025, the American House is divided, right? And a house divided against itself, cannot stand for long. And we are in the grips of what Codeville called the logic of revolution that we talked about a couple episodes ago. And really, America's constitutional republic is up for grabs. And, what are we going to be able to do? Is there anything that we can do moving forward that might secure the world's best hope for another generation, two generations, and so on? So what do you make of that question, Matt, and kind of where we are? And we've talked often about kind of the present situation. What's your take from your reading of this chapter on where we go from here in terms of the American regime?
Well, Dr. Codevilla's tentative answer was localism. And, as we've talked about before, trying to make room for that kind of difference from place to place. And I think, one of the challenges we have is that we have right now two totalizing ideologies. Right? So that the reaction against the progressive imperialistic enterprise and the march to the institutions has not been to establish room for difference. It has been to win the victory for the other side and to enforce conformity to a new set of pieties. And so, there seems to be very little tolerance or taste for this kind of a solution. Now, maybe that's what you get to after you've exhausted arms on both sides, right? This is what happens when the war has been fought to a bitter conclusion, and both sides, at the end of World War I, right, where just massive body count, and you say at that point, look, we just got to stop this. We can't just keep going like this forever. Can we find that place? And maybe, but that's not what either side is aiming for right now. And so I think the danger of our situation is that we're fighting against a desire to win on one side with a desire to win final victory on the other side, without an appreciation for the possibility of some kind of a peace that would be something other than total victory for one side or the other.
Yeah, and here it's important to remember that probably the person who ushered in what has become, the Trump movement was Codevilla, who wrote this book in 2010 called The Ruling Class, where he kind of begins, who the hell do they think they are? So he was definitely a populist in that way, but I think what Codevilla would advocate is a disciplined populism, not an undisciplined populism, because I think
Right.
that it's a rightful thing to say, who the hell do they think they are? but not to the point where you're not kind of reflecting upon yourself. Who the hell do I think I am? Right? Am I perfect? Do
Yeah.
I have all the answers? So it's not there's no moral equivalence there, but you have to practice ordered liberty in a prudent fashion, and that requires patience. It requires study. It requires a willingness at times to agree to disagree over things that don't really matter at the end of the day, right? Like it's not the end all be all on every single thing. We're rightfully angry, I think, when the American regime is put at risk because of an anti-American element within it. But as we've mentioned in a couple shows, the best way to combat that is, I think, by being Americans at our best.
Right. And I think, this is where the Lincoln model is so helpful, because Lincoln recognized during the Civil War that there were going to be things that he had to do that wouldn't be normal constitutional deeds. When you're having a civil war, not everything is going to be able to work out the way that you would under normal peacetime. But he was very clear about what he was doing, why he was doing it, and the limits to that, and always framing it in terms of the broader effort to save constitutionalism. And I think that's where we really struggle today. There's plenty of desire to combat the enemies of our ancient order, but not with means that are consistent with the long-term restoration of that order. And so if we're going to just centralize all power in the executive, if we're going to treat constitutional constraints as optional things that can be set aside when they're not convenient, and have no limiting principle for that, call everything an emergency, call everything a crisis, and have no ability to really restrain ourselves in our efforts that we're making in order to restore what we claim to be the rule of law and these foundational principles, then it can't possibly end well. There's no way to get to the point where you say, well, we've gone through this period. This you know what time it is. It's the time for counter-revolution. Okay, but then when does it end? There's nothing within the movement itself that has that limiting principle, or that helps us to understand when and why are we acting in ways that would be contrary to our ancient modes and orders, and why are we now moving in a different direction, and when do we stop doing that, and how do we actually teach people the way forward that has to involve restraint and humility and a willingness to sometimes suffer loss in the short term for the gain of the long term, for the goal of the regime.
Yeah, the title of the book, Fighting Enemies, Foreign and Domestic. It's a must. You have to fight your enemies, foreign and domestic. But that expression is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. We don't exist simply to fight enemies, foreign and domestic. We have to do that as a means to preserve our way of life, to preserve an American peace. War is a means to the end, which is peace. So we have to be mindful always of that end in mind.
Absolutely. Well, let's stop there for this week, and appreciate the chance to go through that chapter, and more to come, 3 more chapters as we work our way through the rest of the book, and a nice overview of Dr. Codevilla's career and intellectual projects. So as we shift gears to Tocqueville's crystal ball, we're going to take a little break from sports. This time we have an election coming up next Tuesday, so we want to get our picks in for the big races there. We can briefly note that it looks like, Dave, you're not going to be exactly on point with your baseball prediction. We are now looking at a game 6 with Toronto up 3-2. So the Dodgers win is going to take 7 games. But nevertheless, you've done overall very, very well in predicting the postseason. Can't say the same for myself, but we'll see how it plays out over these next couple of days.
It's been fun to watch. Although the 18-inning game, I turned it off after 9, and Jack wanted to stay up later, and I'm not watching anymore, because you can watch the 10th and 11th. You're like, all right, just one more inning. Inning. That would have taken me to about 1:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. So never mind where you would have been on the East Coast.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun to watch. Yeah, it's an interesting election coming up here on Tuesday. Mamdani is kind of the talk of the town. What's happening? What do you see there? You've got 2 elections close to you, the New York City mayoral race, and then the New Jersey governor's race. What do you see, Matt, happening there?
Yeah, I think there might be some tightening in New York City. There's a lot of energy obviously with Mamdani from the very start, and Andrew Cuomo is not exactly the vessel for some kind of reform alternative, given his background and failures, personal and political. So it's a tough sell. But I do think there's going to be a tightening when it comes to Tuesday. So I'm going to say latest polls have about a 15-point edge for Mamdani. I think it's going to end up around 6 points. So it's going to be close. It's going to lead to recriminations. It's going to be all the Cuomo supporters say, oh, why didn't Sliwell drop out, and we could have won this thing. We could have stopped him. And of course, the response is, why weren't you a better person, Cuomo? Why weren't you a better governor? So, we can have recriminations all the way around, but he is going to be the next mayor of New York City. And we'll see what that means. We've had some serious departures from wisdom there, over several administrations, and it has consequences. They don't happen all at once, but it has consequences over time. New York City is not what it was when we were there at the height of our time at King's. It will continue to get worse if Mamdani is able to do half of what he wants, and so we'll see what that means from our area and for the country.
Think of the lyric from that famous song, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" And who would ever thunk that you would ever say, "Where have you gone, Bill de Blasio?"
Oh boy, yeah.
You did never thought it could get worse, but
Right.
oh man, has it? All right, so I'd agree with you. I think it'll tighten a little bit. I'd say probably a 10-point win for Mamdani. How about I think that the governor's race in New Jersey, though, I actually think that Chattarelli will win that in a nail biter. I think that the governor there, Murphy, is rather unpopular. I think even more unpopular than President Trump in New Jersey. And New Jersey's had a history of kind of going back and forth between both parties in its governorship. So
Yeah.
I think he pulls that one out. So I'm going to say a nail biter in that one.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be like, less than half a point. It's going to be really, really tight. One of those, counting every vote kind of moments. But I mean, last time he outperformed the polls by about 5 points. Now that was a different context because, party out of power, often closes at the last minute in these midterm or intermediate term elections. So maybe not quite that same margin, but it's really only a 2 or 3 point race in the polls at this point. So it won't take much if he has a little late break in his direction, which wouldn't surprise me. So I think he's going to barely pull this off, which would be great because, man, we have been hammered. We only moved here 2.5 years ago, and energy prices through the roof, taxes are horrible. You thought you were escaping New York in some sense for New Jersey, and I think we got a little property tax relief, but then, the energy prices and all the rest. So yeah, it'd be nice to have a little bit of sanity in the state house there in Trenton.
Well, how about the other race that somewhat close, not as close as that Jersey race, the Virginia governor and attorney general races? Who do you think will win those?
Yeah, I think probably governor's going to go according to form. Spanberger's had a pretty consistent lead there, 5, 6, 7, 8 points. So I'm going to say it probably ends up about a 5-point victory and maybe 6 points. Now, of course, the other attorney general race wouldn't be that interesting except for the fact that we have, all the controversy around the Democratic candidate. So, who apparently wants to take out his political enemies. So I think that, the polls have been breaking in the direction of Maori's, and I think that's going to hold. It's hard to get that big of a difference, top of the ballot versus offices further down, like a 10-point spread between those is very rare. I think it's going to happen, though. So I think he wins by maybe 4 or 5 points, and you have a Republican attorney general and a Democrat governor.
Yeah, I agree with you on both races. And I think the thing that makes me think of is that, Youngkin is probably at 50% favorability there in Virginia. And, there's a way to kind of practice the governorship in kind of a sober, kind of even-tempered way that allows you to win office. But it doesn't really allow you to kind of build a movement
Right.
that might have some lasting impact on the state. So, yeah, I think Virginia goes Democrat in the governor's office, and we move forward. So
Yeah. Virginia really needs to consider whether they want to keep doing these one-term term limits for their governor, because it doesn't seem like it serves their purposes that well. But anyway, that's the system they have, and so that's why every 4 years we get a very interesting off-year election in Virginia. Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for joining us. You can follow us on YouTube as well as on any of your major podcast platforms, of course. You can also reach out to us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll look forward to talking to you again real soon.
2020 vision.